Hello, Mark. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Jamie. Glad to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Well, it's an honor to have you as another guest on Sentientist Conversations. I've followed your work and find it really powerful and compelling. And it zeroes in on one of the central, most important concepts in this sentientist worldview I'm trying to develop and popularize. This is really a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest and most important philosophical questions: what's real and what to believe about reality, but then also what and who matters ethically. So they're crazily broad questions. And I have a not so secret agenda because I'm trying to develop and popularize a really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which suggests that we should commit to having compassion for all sentient beings, any being that has the capacity to suffer or to flourish. And when it comes to epistemology, we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason to form credences and try and engage honestly with the world. But I've been lucky in these conversations to talk to a dizzying variety of people, both who agree with and disagree with that philosophy. So it'll be great to understand your own philosophical journey and where you've got to now. But before we get into those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know of your work?
I'm a neuroscientist by training, specifically working in that branch of neuroscience called neuropsychology. In other words, I'm interested in the brain because it is the organ of the mind, and I'm interested in the nature of that relationship. But when I trained, which was in the early 1980s, our conception of the mind within the neurosciences was really extremely narrow and rigid, not that far removed from behaviourism, frankly. So because of my disappointment, because I had trained in neuroscience, I was drawn to neuroscience and neuropsychology in particular because I was interested in the mind from a biological point of view. So I did something rather unusual for a neuroscientist, which is that I trained as well in another field, psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis, for all of its faults, at least takes as its starting point the actual lived life of the mind, the being of the mind. And so I took that tangent in order to equip myself with concepts and methods that can accommodate the subjective aspect of mental life, and brought those into neuroscience. Inevitably, in the process, I also found myself bringing neuroscientific concepts into psychoanalysis. And I have to say that in both directions, it wasn't uniformly welcomed by my colleagues. When I decided to train in psychoanalysis, one of my colleagues memorably said to me, "That's like an astronomer studying astrology." So that's me. I'm a neuroscientist and a psychoanalyst, and I'm interested in the sort of interdisciplinary space between those two fields.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've been so lucky in these conversations, because I'm an amateur in all these fields. So it gives me a chance to sort of dip into all of the interesting parts of all of them. But generally, I find that people whose specialism is very deep can do enormously powerful work, but it always seems to lack some richness or insight, or it's very easy for them to miss something I find deeply important. Whereas people who have a more multidisciplinary approach seem to be able to bring insights together in a much richer, more compelling way. And there's something about the nature of consciousness that, I mean, it's so obviously psychologically compelling to us because it's the essence of every moment of who and what we are. But it does seem to bifurcate people either to almost denying its existence and going down a sort of behaviorist route that tries to put it to one side, or an almost mystical path that treats it as something that is otherworldly and distinct and even magical. And that's one of the reasons I find your work fascinating, because I think there's a quite somewhat obvious resolution to those that we'll dig into later into the conversation. But
well, that's a very simple fact that you've alluded to there, which I have found to be deeply true. That I think, had I not been a neuroscientist, when I trained in psychoanalysis, there's a great deal about it that you see as a neuroscientist that you would not see if you were simply an analyst, and vice versa. It throws things into relief in a different way because you come at them from a different perspective. But in later years, my most recent work to my great surprise, I found myself working also in artificial intelligence. And so I now have a third perspective on these things. And I've rediscovered, found once again the enormous importance of combining different disciplinary perspectives. It's very closely analogous to, if you're born and raised in one culture and then move to another country and live embedded in a different culture, you see your original culture in a way that you could not have seen it if it was all you knew. Very much like that.
Yeah, fascinating. And the AI angle will be another interesting one to dig into when we think about possible futures, because I think many treat that topic as sort of science fiction irrelevance, but I think it may be creeping up on us quicker than we think. So yeah, we'll come back to that too. But let's start with the first of these crazily broad philosophical questions, I guess the one about epistemology and what's real and how to believe. And many of my guests tell that story by talking about whether they grew up originally in, I guess, a family or a society that was maybe more naturalistic and scientific minded, or one that was more supernatural or religious or mystical or spiritual in some way, and how their philosophy about what's real and how to go about believing has shifted over time. So it would be fascinating to know your story on that question.
Well, there's nothing particularly interesting about my family origins in that respect, but there was an important event in my childhood which sharpened my thinking about these things. My parents, my mother was a believing Christian. My father, I never had reason to assume that he was not, until one day when I was maybe 6 years old or so, or perhaps even younger. I know I was going to Sunday school, and I was being taught, all of the things that one learns at Sunday school, without any reason to question it. I was just a kid. The teachers tell you this is how it is, that's how it is. And then one morning on a Sunday, my father came into our bedroom, because I shared a bedroom with my older brother. And he said, I know your mum wants you to go to Sunday school, but it is a matter of choice. Your mum believes in all of that stuff. I don't. So, if you find yourself being skeptical about what they're saying to you and you don't want to go, then you don't have to go.
And this was at 6 years old?
Yeah, I think I might even have been a bit younger.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, because that moment reverberated in subsequent years. And I remember thinking back on it and wondering what was he doing, and came to the conclusion that perhaps this was aimed more at my older brother than at me, and I just sort of got included in the little talk, and perhaps it was something he would have only said to me a few years later. But actually, Jamie, that's not the pivotal event. That was. So I'm answering your question there by saying, what kind of household was I brought up in? We were not a particularly learned or intellectual family. So these things were not discussed in any kind of, we didn't have discussions about anything other than what's for supper. But the decisive event in respect of these sort of metaphysical issues was that my older brother, who I just mentioned, around that time in my childhood, in fact, I think it must have been shortly after the talk from my father, but it's, these things are all lost in the mists of time. My brother fell from a very considerable height, from a 3-story building. He fell onto his head, onto a concrete pavement below, and fractured his skull and had an intracerebral hemorrhage. It was horrific for all concerned. It's, I think, the single biggest event in my life and in his life, of course, and in my family's life, my family of origin. But the point is that he came back from the hospital, after a considerable time, a changed person. He looked the same, but he was not the same. His name is Lee, and I was completely bewildered by this, who's this guy, and where's Lee, and and so I was forced at an early age to confront this question of the relationship between mind and body, the relationship between the person and the organism. And I remember thinking this through in all of its ramifications, and eventually coming to the conclusion that if my brother can be so altered by damage to the tissues of his brain, then surely the same applies to me. That my sentient being must somehow be bound up with the functions of this bodily organ. So that was more than my father's or mother's views, or the views of the Sunday school teachers. It was that event and its immediate aftermath that made me confront the question of mortality, the relationship between body and soul.
Yeah, and I can imagine how that would it would challenge, if not shatter, your notion of the idea of there being a sort of ineffable, pure essence, some sort of spirit or soul that is independent of the physical body and brain that continues regardless, because you saw that connection in a very visceral, horrific way. So I can appreciate how that would shift your thinking about the metaphysics of who we are and our essence. Did that link to thinking about more broadly about metaphysics, about the existence of a deity or other supernatural aspects, or was it all part of a package that when you thought differently about the essence of who we are as individuals, did that have any other effects on your sort of epistemology more broadly?
I want to preface my answer by saying that, because you're asking me about the epistemology of a 5-year-old or whatever I was, and so my prefatory observation is that I think we underestimate little kids. I might have been confronted by these questions in a different way, and perhaps a little earlier, a little more starkly than most. But I've observed in subsequent decades, talking to little ones, they really do think about these things. Around that age or shortly after, these things do start to occur to one. So I'll tell you, obviously all of this is from memory, but I'll tell you what I think the sequence of events was. First of all, one of the main things, of course, that one is taught in Christian Sunday school is that your soul and your body are not one and the same thing. It's fundamental to that whole doctrine. So the point you just made is exactly correct. That it was very hard to sustain, notwithstanding the fact that my father had already sort of undermined my confidence in this religious philosophy. But observing what happened to my brother, there was just the evidence. There it was, that clearly he is his brain. Somehow, he and his brain are inseparable. He was really dramatically changed, and he just was not the same person. I could tell you all sorts of examples of it, but that's the bottom line. And then you extrapolate to your own condition, and you realize, I remember having. I had to have an X-ray. I can't remember why. I must have injured my arm or something. And also as a little kid, and seeing, gosh, there's the evidence. It's absolutely true. I'm made of bones, and it was really quite. I found it all terrifying, I have to say, because it's a small step from that to starting to have intimations of your own mortality. If you believe that you are somehow the same thing as your flesh, your living flesh, then clearly that living flesh, it seems to dissipate. And so, if you are that same thing, then you must dissipate too. And so as a little kid, I really remember it vividly, and this is not a small thing. It was a major factor in my childhood. I lay in bed at night just in state of sheer panic about the fact that I'm going to cease to exist. That everything that I can possibly experience and know is going to disappear. And then, if that's the case, what's the point of doing anything? That also happened to me. I became really depressed as a kid. I remember vividly one flashbulb memory of sitting in my bedroom and not being able to find the energy to tie up my shoelaces and go to school because they just seemed completely pointless. Yeah, and then I'll tell you one further anecdote. Sorry, I'm babbling on, but I remember in one of these panicky moments in my bed at night, feeling this absolute panic. I remember the sort of shivers down my spine, literally, and then going to my mum, to my mum and dad's bed, but going to my mum's side of the bed and waking her up and telling her I was scared, and she said, "What are you scared about?" And then I realized there's no point, and it's going to happen to her too. She can't make it better. And so I told her, as I recall, I'd had a nightmare. So, she could comfort me, even though, what she was comforting me about was not what I was really, just any old comfort was better than that frightened, lonely, terrified thought of, about our own mortality.
Yeah, yeah. And it's understandable in a way, I guess, just because of the way we've evolved, that to conceive, for the entity that is conceiving of everything, to imagine its own non-existence is, by definition, we are the center of the universe from one perspective. So trying to imagine that not continuing is quite a strange thing to cope with, particularly as a young person. But I'd agree with your respect for young humans. I don't think it's too strong to say that the average 5-year-old probably has a more robust, accurate epistemology than the average adult. In a sense that, I don't want to be naive about young children. It's not like we're some sort of perfect state that then is warped, but there's something to the idea that young children are, little scientists in a way. We're using our senses, we're trying to understand, we're open-minded, we're trying to build models of the environment and reality around us and understand ourselves in at least an honest way. We might not know much. Whereas much of that gets trained out of us in later years through social norms and Sunday schools and various other interventions. So I agree. I have that sort of innate respect for our human capacity and how it starts out at a young age when it comes to epistemology.
I agree with all of that.
So would you describe your worldview more generally in that sense as, I guess, naturalistic, that you use evidence and reason to try and form credence and beliefs, or were there any other aspects of, mysticism of the supernatural or things we might think of as non-naturalistic that persisted in your way of thinking at all, or was that, did it all sort of fall by the wayside as you went through those experiences and had those thoughts?
In the wake of the developmental steps that we were just talking about, became atheist, and then, oddly enough, with better education, I changed my mind. I now would describe myself as agnostic, and that is rooted really in a appreciation of the limits of human reason, of our capacity to both observe, perceive, to perceive what is, and to comprehend it. Where I got that humility, if I may call it that. It doesn't sound very humble to say where I achieved this humility, but what made me start to I mean, there are many things, but the main thing was when I started working with neurological patients and observed that, with loss of a particular part of the brain, you lose your ability to perceive and comprehend reality, and it is and with predictable regularity, by which I mean, for example, patients with damage to the right parietal lobe, they're paralyzed down the left side of their bodies, but they don't recognize that they're paralyzed. It's the most obvious thing to the external observer that they're paralyzed, but they deny it. They not just frankly deny it, they clearly do not experience it and do not believe it. And so I could multiply that example many times over. But the point is that impressed on me the realization that we are only able to comprehend as much as the instrument we use to comprehend is capable of.
And it's not a perfect instrument.
It's not a perfect instrument at all. And so you can reverse. So what I'm saying about those patients, they have less than I have, because my brain is more or less intact compared to theirs. But you could say, well, what if I had an extra lobe? What would I perceive if we all had an extra lobe or an extra hemisphere? What would we perceive and understand that we all collectively now currently don't and can't? So I also confess to taking a certain comfort in my ignorance. I think there is a comfort in it, in recognizing, well, I don't know. You can't know. I mean, all the evidence. So I come to the best conclusion I can. And what you were saying earlier about children being little scientists, the mind is fundamentally an evidence-gathering, device where we gather what evidence we have, and we come to the best inferences we can as to what to make of that evidence. In other words, how to explain what is causing us to experience what we do. So I'm not saying that I say, well, there's because we can't know everything, there's no point in trying to know anything. I think that we can be less ignorant, even with our limited instrument. We must do the best we can to understand. And God knows, look, for example, at quantum physics. What the universe is very, very strange and very different from what our naive sensory experience suggests. And that also shows how far we are able to probe beyond, the surface. So I'm a scientist. I'm committed to trying to using the evidence available to me, formulating falsifiable predictions, testing those predictions experimentally, coming up with a better explanation on the basis of those findings, and so on. That's what I do. But I don't. I just recognize that science has limits. That there are some things that we cannot study empirically, and there are some things that we will certainly, as things stand, there's some things we just cannot begin to understand, but we do the best we can with what we've got.
Yeah, thank you. I like that balance. And to my mind, that sense of doubt and humility and comfort not knowing is absolutely central to a naturalistic scientific worldview about the world. There is a caricature of a sort of scientistic way of thinking that is super confident, and we've done the RCTs and we have the spreadsheet and we have the fact. Now, we're done. That's not how science works. There's always, provisional credences. There's always openness to new evidence, or there should be. But I think that's right. You don't have to give up on knowledge, but you also don't have to jump to binary, 100% sure beliefs in anything either. You can keep this space healthily open and make progress.
To say the same thing in a different way, putting the emphasis not on the scientists but on the non-scientists, I think that if we recognize, as you've just said, as all good scientists do, that what we know is provisional, what we know is partial, what we know is fallible, and we constantly try to be less uncertain, but we're never going to be certain about certainly about the big questions. But we do the best we can with what we've got. The other approach, which is to just come up with beliefs, without evidence, I think that approach, the kinds of things we were talking about earlier, like the question of mortality, none of us can ever test any prediction about what happens to me, my subjective experience in being, what happens to me after I die. You can make conjectures, but you can never test them until you die. And so empirically, you've got no hope of gathering data yourself about what happens to you after you're dead. So that's kind of terrifying. That precisely because the uncertainty is cannot be in any absolute sense. It cannot be resolved, and I think it's that's where these beliefs, which speaking sort of psychiatrically, where these delusions come to our aid. We have explanations for things which can't be explained. We have a patch covering that rent between ourselves and reality. And so I have sympathy. I can understand why people come up with all of these pseudo explanations. They're terribly comforting, but they arise from this. What I'm saying is that the recognition of the limits of science and where these overvalued belief systems come from is basically the same. We're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, makes sense. And I'm very open-minded about the possibility that there will be limits to our knowledge. I guess my only 2 points of caution is, one, let's not draw those lines before we're sure. That shouldn't be an excuse for not trying to find out. I think the only way we find out the limits of knowledge is by pushing further and further and never expecting to complete the picture. And the other thing, as you've just said, is in the meantime, don't feel tempted to make stuff up to fill gaps, because that's another way of just closing down the pursuit and closing down the understanding, and it can have dangerous side effects too. So, yeah. Well, that's been a fascinating story. Thank you on this sort of epistemology side, and I think I share almost everything you said there. The second question we come on to is one of ethics and morality, and often that's posed as a challenge to someone who has a more naturalistic worldview. From someone who has, a supernatural worldview or a religious worldview or some other form of, external authority that defines what good and bad are, they will come to someone like you and me and say, well, how can you have an ethical basis for your way forward? You don't have the Quran, or you don't have the Bible, you don't have these lists of rules. So how would you answer that question? And how, again, have you gone through that journey about thinking about, what are good and bad, right and wrong, ethics and morality?
First of all, starting with my parents, and then Sunday school, and then one's whole education and enculturation and so on. I picked up all of the, I endorsed or imbibed all of the ethical and moral belief systems of my own culture. But that's not what drives me now. What the fundamental basis of my ethical and moral compass now, more than anything else, is derived, you might be surprised to hear, neither from religion nor philosophy, but rather from neuroscience. My own particular journey as a neuroscientist, I started out studying brain mechanisms of sleep and dreaming, and I made a fortunate discovery really quite early on in my career, that the brain mechanisms of REM sleep and those of dreaming are not the same, that you can, with damage to a particular part of the brain, you lose dreaming, and REM sleep is preserved. With damage to another part of the brain, you lose REM, you lose the other way around. I can't remember which way I just put it. So the pathway that is crucial for dreaming turns out to be a thing called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system. This is a profound motivational system. We share it with all mammals. And why that struck me was because REM sleep is governed by brainstem mechanisms. And the fact when we discovered REM sleep and its brainstem mechanisms, it was taken as a basis for showing that all of these psychological and folk psychological ideas about dreams being meaningful and so on, that it's all mumbo jumbo, because the brain stem is just like a kind of automaton. And what these nuclei are doing is motivationally neutral. It's got nothing to do with, wishes and so on, which is, for example, what the Freudians speak about. But this structure that I found is also rooted in the brain stem, but it's very much not a neutral automaton. It's the essence of our motivational drive. And so that led me to a reconsideration of these very basic brainstem structures. I was fortunate then to come across the work of Jaak Panksepp, who was the expert. I say was because sadly he died few years ago. He showed us how there are these deep, evolutionarily ancient circuits sourced in the brainstem, which give rise to our basic emotions. And when I say our, here I'm speaking about mammals, because the circuitry for these basic emotions are the same in all mammals. It's not that we share some of these circuits also with all vertebrates and so on, but all mammals have the same basic emotional circuitry. And it's mammals are 200 million years old, so these basic motivational and emotional systems are 200 million years old. They predate by a very long shot any philosophy, any religion, and yet these are. I don't want to reduce everything to these systems, but this must surely be the foundation of all of our values. These emotional value systems that we are literally born with. It's nothing to do with culture and education. So, for example, pain is bad. Everyone knows that just because it is.
Believe me, I've spoken to philosophers who will argue about that for a long time. But no, I'm with you. I mean, almost just definitionally, that's almost what the words pain and suffering mean, is a negatively valent state as experienced by the experiencer. So yeah.
So there are things like pain and disgust. When you've imbibed something that's toxic or otherwise noxious, the fright from a startle, hunger, sleepiness, these things all feel bad. These are basic bodily values, But it's not only bodily; there also are emotional values. And now I'm referring to these basic emotional circuits. There's a circuit for fear. You don't need to learn that it's bad to cause fear in somebody. It's horrible to be scared and to feel you're threatened and you're in danger and you need to escape. It's not something cultural. Likewise, separation distress. We mammals, and this we share with birds. If you separate a juvenile mammal from its caregiver, it shows separation distress, distress vocalization, searching behavior, and this is not learned. So we just know from the get-go that it's bad to separate a baby from its caregiver. And a baby that's crying, we don't like it. It's horrible. We want to make it better. So I could go on at length. I'll just say that these emotions, things like, for example, fear, separation distress, and separation distress is what we feel when we have lost our caregiver. And we become separated from our attachment object. There's also a corollary, nurturing instinct that what I said, when a little baby cries, it makes you feel bad and you want to make it better because, we have a nurturing care instinct drive as us mammals. And you can see the biological value of that. You're looking after your offspring is good for the basic task of biology, which is to pass on your genes, and rage to get rid of a frustrating, impeding object, and lust, all of these things we don't learn them. So I think that I believe that there are innate values that underwrite all of these other more elaborated, sophisticated, philosophical and religious, ethical and moral schemes. And I say again, I don't think we can reduce our values to the basic emotions, but I think that's where they spring from. And therefore, that's where you asked me, where does my sense of what's right and wrong and good and bad come from if I don't hold to any religious worldview? Well, that's where it comes from. The question then is a twofold further question. The one is, these different emotional motivations and values, they conflict with each other. So, you can't, it's not enough to just, like, for example, I've said that this attachment drive makes you want to keep the object who loves you and cares for you, nurtures you, you want to keep them close to you forever and always. But the other drive, the rage one, if somebody frustrates you, impedes you, gets between you and what you want, your innate inclination is to attack, to get rid of this obstacle. And now those two drives get directed toward the same object. I mean, whose mother never frustrated them? So you then have to reconcile the fact that you both love and need this person, and they frustrate and annoy you. How are you going to deal with that conflict? That's where learning and education and enculturation and so on kick in. And then the other big factor is that we, of course, are not evolutionarily equipped to live in the sorts of environments that we do. We have an evolutionary preparedness for relatively small groups that are hunter-gatherers or something equivalent, and now we live in cities and in very large numbers, and there's property, and so there have to be all sorts of laws and artificial systems. I mean, starting ultimately ending in United Nations and the Bill of Rights and all of these sorts of things. In other words, I'm saying I really do mean it when I say I don't think we can reduce our value systems to these basic biological ones. They can't accommodate everything that we have to deal with. But I think the idea that if you don't hold to a religious worldview, then you have no basis for being ethical and moral. I think that's nonsense. So there's a biological basis for ethics and morality.
Yeah, it's fascinating the way you told that story, because I'd agree. There's so much complexity in ethics and morality, but I'd be with you. Right? The raw materials of it, if you like, ultimately the basis come back to those facts about us as sentient beings. And I'm sometimes a bit sloppy in my language because I'm not an academic in these fields, but the way I describe it, and the reason I focus on sentience, I describe sentience as the capacity to have experiences, particularly valenced experiences. And I might use the word suffering to describe all the negative stuff. So that's pain, existential loss, any negative feeling, physical, emotional, or otherwise. And flourishing maybe is a very broad term for any of the good stuff, physical pleasure, love, companionship, satiation, whatever it might be as well. So would you draw a distinction between the way you described it and my use of the word sentience, or do you think they are the same sort of thing? Because I'm quite aware there are different, there's emotion, there's different forms of affect, there's consciousness, there's sentiences.
So I want to say one thing before I address that question. When I was talking about the basic emotions a moment ago, I didn't mention one that I think I should have mentioned, which is play. We mammals need to play. Every juvenile mammal plays. And the crucial thing about play is that, because you might think, you can see why lust and fear and rage and separation distress and so on are biologically important, but play, I mean, it's not even real. It's play, so why do we have an innate need to play? And so we've studied play very deeply. And the important point that I wanted to get in here is that it's through play that we learn how to negotiate between what I need and what others need. It's a social. We all want to meet our own needs, but we have to learn how to meet our needs in relation to the needs of others, because we're a social species. We live in groups, and so this whole thing of learning reciprocity and mutuality, of taking account of how's the other. If you dominate too much in play, your playmate won't play with you anymore. They say you're not being fair.
So negotiation, cooperation. Yeah.
So that's very important. Play is really a very fundamental emotion in relation to where our system of rules, standards, boundaries, what is permissible and what's not permissible in relation to the needs of others. So I just wanted to get that in also. To come back to the question of terminologies. So emotion is a higher word than affect. Emotional affects are a subset of affects. Affects include bodily affects of the kind I mentioned earlier, like hunger and sleepiness and pain and so on. They are valenced, so they're affects, but they're not emotions. And the difference between emotions and bodily affects is a long and complicated story. But then when we go down deeper than that to sentience in general, the interesting thing is, I spoke earlier of the work of Jaak Panksepp and how he more than anyone else drew our attention to the fact that all of these emotion circuits and I say, in other words, even the emotional circuits, let alone all the affect circuits, all of them, and I mean all of them, converge on the midbrain, on the brain stem, on the periaqueductal gray, which is directly adjacent to the reticular activating system. Now, the reticular activating system is where the light switch is, so depending on how you define sentience, if we can just use it as synonymous with consciousness for now, the most fundamental source of our consciousness in the sense of us not being in a coma, in the sense of us not being asleep, what wakes you up in the morning, what is damaged in comatose patients, you need only damage 2 cubic millimeters of the parabrachial complex to cause a coma in a human being. So this is the most concentrated consciousness generating tissue that we know. That what Panksepp showed us is that this tissue is also affect generating. So there is no such thing as consciousness which is not, in its most elementary form, consciousness is valenced. Consciousness is affective. The whole point of consciousness is for the creature to know how it's doing within a biological scale of values. So, it's not just reflex. What consciousness adds is I am aware, I feel that this is going well, this is going badly, so I can make choices. It's that you don't just have automatized responses, you have voluntary behaviors. Voluntary is the opposite of automatic, and voluntary therefore means based in choice rather than reflexive compulsion. And so the very basis of us being able to make choices is that we feel whether this is going well or badly, and so we adjust our behavior accordingly and learn accordingly. So what worked well in the past, we're more inclined to do in the future, and conversely, what caused us unpleasant states, suffering, to use your term, those are things that we will avoid doing in future. So the term consciousness for me is synonymous with feeling. Feeling is the basic form of consciousness, affective feeling. We start with just this. So consciousness just is. I feel like this, not in words, but I feel like this, and then secondarily it becomes I feel like this about that, and so our consciousness is extended onto our representation of the world around us. We feel our way into our cognitions. So when you said, we must be careful about terms, emotion, affect, sentience, I would say that they're deeply confluent, those terms. When you look at the anatomy and physiology of consciousness, you're ultimately led to the realization that the brainstem nuclei, which are homeostatic, which are maintaining us within our viable parameters, that those brainstem nuclei are the very same nuclei that give rise to consciousness in its most rudimentary sense. So,
thank you.
In a nutshell, consciousness, sentience, and feeling are the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And part of the reason I tend to focus on sentience as a concept, one is because sentientism is already too long as a word. It has too many syllables, whereas consciousnessism has even more. So that's one reason. The more serious reason is partly because, to my mind, sentience is, if you like, the morally salient aspect of consciousness. So some people will force extra stuff into their concepts of consciousness. They'll talk about the ability to plan for the future or some sort of advanced higher order self-representation or some degree of sapience and intelligence as well. And in a sense, that's all very interesting to me. But the morally salient aspect of consciousness is just the basic capacity to, I feel this way. And in a way, some people use consciousness and sentience as completely synonymous. And for others, sentience is more focused on that, I feel this way aspect of consciousness. But yeah, I agree. They're very confluent terms. But
just in relation to the distinction you drew there between, these higher order forms of consciousness and the more basic forms, I think it was a big mistake in my field for us to focus on the uniquely human forms of consciousness as our model example of what we mean by consciousness. I think that, if you want to solve a problem, if you want to understand a phenomenon in nature, you take its most elementary form, and then you build up from there to understand what these additional bells and whistles that we humans have, what they do. But the fundamental form of consciousness, in other words, feeling in and of itself, I agree with you entirely. That is also the morally and ethically pertinent aspect of consciousness. But it's no small detail that it is the foundation of all the other stuff. You can't have any of these higher forms of consciousness in the absence of the lower form. As I said, you just take out 2 cubic millimeters of reticular activating system and all the rest of it collapses. It's all predicated on feeling. And feeling, because there's a goodness and a badness to it, it's intrinsically, there's an intrinsic value system built into it.
Yeah, I mean, feeling is the foundation and all the other stuff is interesting, but it's sort of built on that,
yes.
I guess. And I think, I'd agree with that view. And I think some of it has been, again, as an amateur from the outside, driven by genuine, appreciation and an understanding of the fact we are quite a special animal. So, let's dig into the right ways we're special. Some of it also does seem to be anthropocentrically reverse engineered as a desperate way of trying to justify how special and unique we are. And therefore we can push those, non-human animals to the side and continue doing what we do to them. And, obviously the extreme version was the sort of Descartesian denial of animal consciousness completely. And shockingly, there are still some scientists and philosophers who think that way today. It's
not a few, I'm afraid. I'm in the thick of that world, and I still have many an argument with very highly respected animal neuroscientists. If I may mention a name, because he's a friend of mine, he knows I mean him no ill will. But even somebody as eminent as Joseph Ledoux, whose field of study is the emotional circuitry of the mammalian brain, he has great difficulty accepting the sorts of things you and I have just been talking about.
Yeah, I struggle to understand it. I mean, partly because the story you've told about, I guess, how sentience and consciousness came into being seems to have such a strong and clear evolutionary adaptive rationale that goes, way back into the biological history that, as you said, predates humans by many millions of years. So the idea that it could have such an ancient evolutionary history, but still not be present broadly in the animal kingdom seems, I can't get my head around. It seems to have an echo of this sort of supernatural thinking that, the religious way of making humans feel special is obvious. We have souls, we have spirits, we have been chosen by God to have dominion, just as an example. But it seems that even many people with a very naturalistic worldview are desperately trying to find some way of partitioning us off and separating us. And
when Jaak Panksepp, who I keep mentioning, was attributing emotional feelings to small mammals like rodents, his colleagues said to him, "You're anthropomorphizing those animals," and he said, "No, I'm zoomorphizing us."
Yeah.
And I really like that. But the more rational, because of course there are irrational things that get into everything. Human narcissism is not a rational thing. But the more rational conversations I've had with colleagues who are skeptical about animal emotions, they start with the not unreasonable point that, we can only know our own consciousness, the problem of other minds, and that we can only observe our own. And therefore, one extreme view would be to say, well, therefore I can't be sure that anyone else is conscious at all. But because other human beings look like us, behave like us, we can infer, well, they clearly are the same species as me. Therefore, I know I'm conscious, therefore there's every reason to believe that they are. That's where they start, and then they start saying, well, how can you know in relation to any other creature? Because they're not like us. How do you know what the crucial difference is and isn't? And then it hinges on this thing called reportability. I think that's a whopping great mistake. That my colleagues say, but if you define consciousness in any way other than the ability to report it, then how can you ever know it's there? And I think that's so absurd. When you're required to show you are not a robot on the internet, you have to. It doesn't say, please type here, I am not a robot. In other words, declare it. It asks you to solve a problem, which, in other words, it's a test of what kind of capacities you have, which suggests empirically, that there's somebody home, that you're not a robot. And I think that that's the way that we need to proceed. That we know in the human brain, as I was saying a few minutes ago, that these brainstem structures are the font of a conscious arousal and feeling. And there's oodles of evidence for that. You stimulate these structures, you stimulate feelings big time, the most intense and the just variety of feelings by far are stimulated in these brainstem structures. And then you say, well, since these other creatures have the same structures, we have to assume that they do the same thing. So therefore, I predict that if I stimulate this structure, which in me causes extreme unpleasure, in another creature with the same structure, they will then avoid the stimulus, and that prediction is confirmed. And conversely, if I stimulate that which in us causes orgiastic delight, if I stimulate that in another creature with the same structure, that it will approach the stimulus and become rather keen on it, that prediction is confirmed. That's science. You can't do anything more than that, So that's the way we do it. And it's on. So we've been speaking about mammals. In fact, those structures in the rudimentary forms of consciousness generating structures are not. It's those emotion circuits I said we share with all mammals. Some of them we share with all vertebrates. And these all vertebrates have a reticular activating system and a periaqueductal gray. And every time we ask empirically, are you conscious? Not do you feel something? Not by asking them to say it to us, but by their behavior, which is normal science. You make a prediction. This is what's going. If I'm right, then when I do this, that will happen. It always happens. The answer is always yes. So I think that at the very least, we have to assume. At the very least, I emphasize that we have to assume that sentience, that feeling, exists in all vertebrates. Therefore, that it's about 600 million years old. But I think that's there's good reason to infer from the behavior, for example, of the octopus with cephalopods. They have very different brains from us, but so it's much harder to tell. But so and when you think about what feeling is for, what I was just saying earlier, it raises you above the level of reflex. So it enables you to deal with unpredicted situations, and heaven knows there's enough of that in the universe, that it's full of unpredictable situations. And so to be able to then make choices, it's a massive adaptive advantage. And it's quite. I find it entirely incomprehensible that people, that my colleagues don't recognize that rudimentary form of consciousness must go back a very long way, and any creature that is capable of voluntary behavior, of making choices, those choices must be rooted in a value system, and feelings seem to be those values. Anyway, sorry, I'm really repeating myself now, Damien.
No, it's great. I mean, it makes sense.
Move
And
us along.
As I said at the beginning, the danger is that we just agree too much, because I love the way you think this through. Now, this sentientism worldview, I'm suggesting, just says naturalism, and it just says Sentience Matters, if you like. It's neutral on philosophy of mind. So it doesn't say what sentience or consciousness is. It doesn't say, how you have to think about that. It just says whatever, suffering and flourishing are, they are morally salient. We should care about them. We should have compassion for them. So, but at the same time, I do find philosophy of mind fascinating. And, one stance that would, push back on your and my way of thinking is a panpsychist way of thinking. So, we've already talked about the idea that maybe feelings are the foundation, but then people add extra stuff into definitions of consciousness. In a way, the panpsychists almost go the other way and say, they strip it down to the degree that it's an essential element of almost everything. And I think when you describe, using the "I'm not a robot" test, they might challenge you in the same way as you challenge the behaviorists. They would say, well, you're just looking at the behavior, just looking at the stuff, the reports on the outside, yeah, but what is the essence of the sentience itself? What is the thing? What is the fire in the equations? Aren't you missing something just by examining this sort of from the outside? The whole wonder of sentience and consciousness is it's an ineffable private thing that somehow feels really powerfully, must be distinct from information processing or all the other stuff going on with the reports. What's your general response to that?
It would be wonderful if panpsychism was an accurate description of the place of consciousness in the universe, because that means even when you dissipate upon your death, all your little particles are still going to be conscious in some form.
Yeah. Although, as I understand it, you'd be very lucky for them to recombine in a way that would create your consciousness.
But more than very lucky, yes, it would be the most unlikely possible.
Absolutely, yeah.
But my approach to the panpsychist question is, I've told you in a potted way during this conversation how I was led through my own scientific life to the conclusion that these brainstem nuclei are the in our own case, these are what generate consciousness. And that when we look at all other creatures that have these same nuclei, every testable prediction as to whether or not they're conscious, as I already told you, the answer is always yes. So then the question becomes, okay, how do these structures work? What do they do? That's a scientific question. And because there are many things going on in my body, which I'm not conscious of. So just being a human being doesn't mean I'm conscious of everything that's going on inside of the boundary of my skin. There's certain, it seems that the nervous system is particularly important. You only become aware consciously of other parts of your body because they're represented nervously. They are represented in the brain. So, it's clear that, like, for example, peristalsis, you have nothing to do with it. Blood pressure regulation, you have nothing to do. It's entirely automatic, it's entirely non-conscious process.
Is it possible there are distinct nuggets of consciousness that I'm not aware of that are running those things, that are just thinking breathe in, out, that? But
I can understand that, but let's take this, because if we're scientists, then we go with the evidence. We start with the evidence. I am conscious. I know I am. I can observe it. I'm a human being. We find which structures are there in the human brain which generate this consciousness that I am aware of, unlike this hypothetical consciousness that might be there in some other part of my body that I'm not aware of. This one I know is here. And then I strip it down to its essentials, and I find that it's a homeostatic mechanism, as I said. That's basically absolutely how it works, that all of these feelings are homeostatic. When you're in your viable bounds, you don't feel anything. When you move out of your bounds, you feel an unpleasure of a particular category, hunger, thirst, pain, sleepiness, rage, fear, whatever. And then if you're moving back into your viable bounds, then you feel pleasurable feelings. So we know what the mechanism is of the feelings of the sentience that we do know we have. And so then that mechanism, you have to understand what is that, how does that work? That takes us beyond, it takes us into self-organizing systems. Homeostasis is a biological manifestation of self-organization. In other words, systems that persist, systems that resist entropy, that don't dissipate, systems that continue to exist. They they have to work at continuing to exist, because the second law of thermodynamics says things just dissipate.
Yeah.
Always, entropy always increases in every natural process. Living things oppose entropy, and they do it through homeostasis. So if that is from what we've been taking from our own personal subjective experience, going all the way through the evidence, we come to the conclusion that the mechanism whereby feeling, the elementary form of consciousness, is generated, it's an extended form of homeostasis. Then I have difficulty believing that any other system that doesn't have this basic mechanism, there's no, what evidential basis is there for thinking that it too is conscious? So at that point I start losing confidence in anyone who says, well, because this is conscious, everything else might be too. There is absolutely no scientific reason to believe it. And it's not just going from the phenomena down to the mechanism. It's then whenever you find that mechanism in another creature, you can predict it should be able to make choices. It should not function absolutely stereotypically and automatically. And that's what we find. So a thing that functions absolutely stereotypically and automatically, it doesn't display any of the functionality that feeling seems to be for. Feeling seems to be for being able to do more than just always do the same thing. And, I'm talking there about, for example, single cells and so on. They are bacteria. I don't believe they're conscious because they don't behave in any way that suggests that they're conscious. They certainly clearly are alive, but their behavior is 1000% predictable. There's absolutely no choices they make. They always do exactly the same thing in the same circumstances. And those are bacteria. They're alive. You then go to rocks and you think, for heaven's sake, what
atoms and quarks, yeah.
So I have great difficulty accepting the panpsychist view. I certainly do accept that there's a gray area, where we become less certain about, is this thing sentient or isn't it? Just to show you, I'm not fundamentalistic. I also believe that if we have got the fundamental mechanism whereby feelings are caused, this homeostatic mechanism is nothing complicated. We understand how it works. I mean, we can reduce it to causal equations. And so I'm even of the view that it should be possible to artificially engineer such a thing. I'm even willing to believe that it's possible that you could have an artificial computer-based agent which has the same functionality. In other words, its basic design principle is that it's seeking to continue existing, and it has various categories of needs that it has to satisfy in order to do so, and deviations from those needs are existential threats to its continued existence, and that if it had this capacity to be able to register how it's doing here and now, in uncertain situations, I would be willing to entertain the possibility that even a non-living thing which has that functionality might have some artificial version of some artificial form of sentience. So I'm not prejudiced about, when I say I'm not a panpsychist, it's the principled scientific reasons for rejecting panpsychism in my view.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm with you all the way on that. I think, and when people say, you're not getting to the essential essence of consciousness, you're just describing it in a scientific way, you're looking from the outside. I don't see a fundamental difference between that criticism and saying of, a particle physicist, you're not really getting to the essence of a quark or an electron, you're just looking at its effects or its behavior. And it's like, well, one, what else can we do but try and use our experience and evidence to try and understand things? And two, if there is some, if the essence of a thing is even a meaningful concept, why make up something to fill that gap? Again, it sort of echoes our earlier conversation. If we don't know what the essence of a quark is, or some quantum field is, or sentience, why posit something that we don't have evidence to support?
Absolutely.
So I don't necessarily think there's a radical difference between those two challenges. The answer is just let's use science to try and work it out. I also don't see a radical difference between the reports of other people about their consciousness and our own internal self-reports about our consciousness. There's a sense to which obviously my own consciousness feels radically special and different, and ultimately the only thing I'm 100% confident exists. But in a way, aren't I just reporting internally about that? And is that radically different from the reports I might get from somebody else? And ultimately, I can imagine a situation where, in the future of fMRI scanners or PET scanners or artificial intelligence, we might be able to, get right down to an even deeper level, to the extent that someone could watch my brain activity and understand what I'm thinking. You might even be able to have a BAT emulator installed that will help you answer Nagel's question of what it really feels like. Because in a sense, I think ultimately consciousness and sentience are really classes of information processing that have evolved for the reasons you've laid out, that it proved adaptive to conceive of this pattern of matter that as something that needs to persist, needs to understand itself, needs to understand agents, needs to understand the environment. And valence is a way of going towards the good and away from the bad, and that's pretty much it. But there's another approach to panpsychism that I don't agree with either, but I think is more intellectually attractive, which is, my approach is a sort of very hardline, naturalistic, materialist, physicalist. I just think that consciousness is what it happens to feel like to run this class of information processing. That's it. It's just a useful word to describe that. So in that sense, I don't see that there's anything radically different between the information processing that's going on in my head now and the information processing in my laptop, or even the information processing in my thermostat. I think it's all information processing. It's configured in different ways, it operates in different ways, but there's no magical difference there. And as you implied, there's probably is a sort of fuzzy area where it becomes difficult to tell whether consciousness is there or not. So some people who are drawn into a panpsychist view take that approach, and they almost say that because there's sort of fuzzy boundaries, maybe it just gets less and less conscious and less conscious, but ultimately there's still information processing going on in the electron as it spins around. Maybe there's some sort of minimally conscious sense of what it's like to be an electron. And I don't follow them down that path, but it seems to be slightly more coherent to me than this sense of, I intuitively feel this thing that seems somehow magical, therefore I will posit it as the foundation of all physics, which is a bit harsh. But
yeah, many people don't realize that David Chalmers, the author of the term, the hard problem of consciousness, in his paper on the hard problem, when he first formulated it in 1995, he took that view that you've just enunciated, that all information, as he put it, the internal aspect of information is consciousness. That the being of information is conscious, is what we mean by being conscious. And it's a very little bit of information is a very little bit conscious. Now, I'll tell you what my problem is with that. If you go to Shannon's original, his 1948 paper, where the concept of information as a quantity was introduced into physical science, the title of that paper is A Mathematical Theory of Communication. So information requires an information source and an information receiver. You have to, so his famous binary digits, 1 or 0, the bit binary digit. It's an answer to a question. Information is, as Shannon defined it, which is the natural scientific understanding of information, is it's got to do with probability. The more unpredictable a system is, the more information it contains. The more predictable it is, the less. Like flick a coin, there's only 2 possible outcomes. That's 1 bit of information. Is it heads? Yes or no. Okay. Roll a dice. There's 6 possible states, and so the base 2 log of 6 is 3. So there are 3 bits of information. There are 3 questions you have to ask. Is it odds or evens? Is it more than 4? And then you have to ask the further question of, okay, is it 4? Then you get to you can predict, you can know how much, you can know what the state is of this thing this event, the rolling of the dice, you can know what state it's actually in. In other words, which number is up. And so the more unpredictable the thing is, the more information, which means the more questions you need to ask in order to describe the state of that system. So this is the rub in what I'm saying, is that you can't speak of information in Shannon's sense without speaking of a question asker. Who you have to ask a question. Information isn't something that just exists in itself. It intrinsically has to do with, what do you want to know about? So there has to be a measurement that's taken. And this goes also into all sorts of fascinating questions about quantum physics, where the actual making of the measurement is such a crucial part of how we understand quantum phenomena. So the asking of the question requires some, so the question becomes, if you're going to say that information is the fundamental sort of property of sentience, then I would have to say, well, then you have to tell me where the question asker is. That's as I said, there's a source and the receiver has to ask the question of the source, and then you get your 1 or 0 or whatever the answer is, the more and more complex answers. So information in itself doesn't exist unless there's the asking of questions, and so therefore you have to introduce agents that are asking these questions. So for me, it comes down ultimately to, where do question askers come from? And so that brings us back to homeostasis, which is, what will happen to my entropy if I do that? That's what feeling is. That's the information. It's saying, that's good, that's bad. 1, 0, good, bad. So it's only a self-organizing system, a system which has some goal, which needs to ask questions in order to obtain answers, because it's trying to, because the wonderful phrase that Daniel Dennett used was that the computer has to give a damn. It has to matter to the thing for it to need to extract the information in the first place. So I think that the idea that all information is somehow, and also the opposite idea, who is it, Tononi, who says, it's a matter of how integrated the information is. I think one bit of information carries no jot of consciousness, and lots of information just by itself. It's not. It's a matter of the configuration of the system that is asking the questions. I think that's where sentience comes from.
Yeah.
It's the giving a damn about the needing to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you. No, I like that perspective. And I think even more broadly, if we're going to get to the stage where we're saying, even a quark has some base level of consciousness, I think we've almost destroyed the concept of what consciousness means. We've taken it so far away from why we are trying to understand this phenomenon in the first place that we've almost rendered it meaningless. So, yeah, I find that a difficult path
I think
to go
it's
down.
very much like the idea of God. If you accept that there was a Big Bang long before living things emerged on planet Earth, then you have to assume there was a very long there was a very long time before living after bacteria and things of that, single-celled organisms, before they become conscious organisms. I think that you have to accept that consciousness must have emerged out of something more elementary.
Yeah.
The alternative is that consciousness was there from the beginning, and that is pretty much like the idea. In the beginning, there was,
Yeah.
some super sentience.
Yeah, and again,
that just existed forever.
And this isn't fair of all panpsychists, but I'm nervous that it's yet another example of this desperation for us humans to put ourselves at the center of everything. So we did it with heliocentricity. We did it with a God that, apparently we were created in their image. And I'm just worried that this is another instance of, us and our consciousness being so overwhelmingly important to ourselves that we have to posit it as central to even the foundation of everything. So I'm not sure, that's not a fair motivation, because I think many panpsychists talk about it in a very different way. One is of humility, everything is conscious. We're not special, but I think there's still something to that. But anyway, we should leave the philosophy of mind for a moment, because that was a fascinating tangent to my normal conversations. But given your work on this, I could not resist delving into that for you. But to come back to the ethical question, the other thing that I think was really interesting is the way you described it. To my mind, if it doesn't break the sort of is-ought distinction, it at least softens it or sidesteps it, because you seemed very comfortable talking about how something feels, being bad or good, being directly related to bad or good ethics, i.e. needlessly causing an entity to feel bad is a bad thing to do. And I feel I find that almost definitionally compelling as a way of thinking about what morality is, because I'm not sure what morality is if it isn't some form of concern for others. And as soon as we're concerned for others, we're concerned for how things are going for them, their well-being, their suffering, their flourishing. So I like that framing. I think some people will challenge it, but I don't see how you can distinguish those things. And if you do, I think you end up with some very dangerous ethics. But the second, so I'd share that foundation, if you like, the raw materials of ethics with you. The second part of this question really is about moral scope, because I think almost every human has compassion of some sort. Even the worst humans, love their own mothers normally. But there's a critical question, which I think is widely neglected in philosophy and public thought generally, which is, okay, who gets to be included in our scope of moral consideration? And there's an implication in what you say that I agree with, that if sentience is the raw material of ethics, that in a sense, all flourishing, all suffering should matter, and therefore all sentient beings should be morally considerable. We should have some degree of compassion for them all. That's a theoretical concept, I guess, which in practical terms, for example, per our conversation on Twitter, has led me to veganism, for example, because I think veganism essentially is trying to avoid exploiting or needlessly harming or suffering any sentient being. It flows directly from that. But I'm interested in your view about the practicality of that ethics. One, is that how you set your scope of moral consideration? Again, you hinted that even AI, if it becomes sentient, you might care about them too. But also your journey and how and whether then, to what degree that can be put into effect practically, because that's another area that is fraught with social norms and indoctrinations and difficulties.
I want to start by just picking up on a throwaway line that you made at the beginning of what you just said now about referring to the you can't derive an ought from an is. You said it doesn't quite do away with it. I think it does do away with it. I think that you can derive an ought from an is. Once you know what is in terms of these basic affective values of creatures that are equipped with affectivity, I think that there's an ought that flows from that, because everything you said earlier, well, not earlier, you said now, that morality must have to do with reducing suffering, for needless suffering in others. It must have something to do with, it's bad to cause suffering, and it's good to minimize it. That is, I think, the fundamental. I mean, it's the consequentialism. This is what it's all about, and I think that you can't. I don't see how you can define you can even begin to talk about these things without starting with feelings. What do you mean by bad and good if you don't mean it causes suffering, and it reduces suffering? So it's all got to do with feelings. So that leads to the answer to the big question that you're asking, which is that it must the set of who we have to have compassion for, or what we have to have compassion for, is anything that can suffer. That surely the basic value must be, we must minimize suffering, minimize needless suffering, and anything that can suffer has to be included within that net. There is a fuzziness, as I said earlier. I have no compunction whatsoever about including all vertebrates in that net. I think it starts to get a bit blurred after that. I'll tell you my own opinion is that insects do feel, and that cephalopods do feel. My own opinion is, as I said, that bacteria don't, and I also don't believe that plants do. So, accepting that there's a gray area, I would say everything that we have reason to believe, scientific reason to believe, has feelings, not philosophical conjectures that it's possible, but that there's scientific reason to believe that this thing. I say thing because, as you correctly picked up on, I don't believe it necessarily has to include only living things. I believe it is possible to engineer artificial feeling machines, and then they have to be incorporated. They then have, we have to have concern about, like, why would you want to make a sentient robot? What do you want it to do for you? Can that be right? Is it not a new form of slavery? So anything that has a capacity, that we have reason to believe has capacity to feel, has to be included within that net. So, I mean, I was giving a very simple answer to your question, but I think the answer is simple.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in a way, that's the sort of irony, because so many thousands of words of brilliant thinking have been written on these topics of epistemology and moral scope. But I think the answers really are quite that simple. All suffering matters. You can go back to Bentham and and answer that question. Can they suffer? I think that is the essential question. Almost flows from the definition of morality. But maybe we should come on to the final section, because I think when we're thinking about how to make the world a better place, in a sense, our answer to that question defines the scope. I guess we're saying, how can we make the world and even the universe better for all sentient beings? And how might we go about that, or at least make it less bad? And it strikes me often that we're in a weird position, because I think you and I share a naturalistic way of understanding the world, but most human beings on the planet, at least in some domains, disagree with this because they hold to arbitrary, fabricated, or unfounded beliefs, whether they're religious or otherwise. So in a sense, we share a sort of quite strong common sense, I think almost self-evident stance, but we're still in the minority. And I think when it comes to moral scope, again, most humans might agree with this technically, because I think most people have some degree of compassion for non-human animals. But whether it's because of social norms or cultural context or the way people were brought up, whatever it is, most people around the planet, at least in practical terms, do exclude vast tranches of sentient beings from their moral consideration, whether it's wild animals, farmed animals, or actually other groups of humans. And we can see the horror that does with intrahuman ethics as well. So again, it feels like both of those stances are sort of almost self-evident, almost tautologically. It's like, how could people disagree? But nearly every one of the 8 billion do. So in that context, it feels like sometimes the challenges that are facing us in the future are more ones of human psychology and sociology and social norms than they are necessarily of working out answers and working out ethics. But how does that leave you thinking about the best ways of making a better future for all sentient beings? And you can go sort of Star Trek utopian vision. You can think about human ethics causes. You can think about non-human animal ethics, for example, or the role of psychoanalysis and the work you do in very practically trying to help individual sentient beings feel better. But it's a crazily broad question, but you can go wherever you'd like with how to fix all the world's problems.
Well, I will give you probably just two thoughts on that, and maybe they're reducible. Maybe they end up being the same thought. In the Sunday school that we spoke about at the beginning of our conversation, I was taught that you must love your neighbor as yourself. And I remember, I really do remember when the Sunday school teacher said that to me and explained what it meant. And it also had something to do with us giving our Christmas presents away or something. I thought, what? What kind of philosophy is this? And later on in life, when I was better educated and understood things more deeply, I actually came to the view that that's a basic Christian ethic, and I think it's a very good one. Love your neighbor as yourself means, to me, it means that if you recognize that there are other sentient beings, then you know what your feelings mean to you. If you recognize that others have the same thing, then you have to recognize that they have the same self-interest you do. So there's nothing wrong with taking account of your own self-interest, as long as you recognize you're not the only one. You have to take account of everyone's self-interest. That was to the extent that I found it necessary to develop some sort of moral philosophy of my own as to how I'm going to behave, both not only clinically but socially. I mean, I live in a very unequal country where I come from a very privileged background, where one lives, one sees and has to resist the temptation to not see, terrible suffering every day, and it's overwhelming. So in my trying to navigate a course through all of these things, needing to have some compass, I found, ironically, I found myself settling on this Christian ethic that you must love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, recognize your neighbor is a self too. And here I'm not only speaking about my human neighbors, I'm speaking about sentient creatures or sentient things in the sense that we've been talking about. So it's sort of like Kant's categorical imperative, I suppose, is what it boils down to. But now, the reason I start like that, I said I'm going to tell you two things, and they might be the same thing, is that when I then start looking at myself, I must love my neighbor as myself. Well, I'm a mixed bag. I'm not a saint. When I came back, I left South Africa during apartheid, because those days people who looked like me were conscripted into the apartheid army. And so I in fact moved to England. I lived in England for 14 years. And then I came back here after the dawn of democracy here. And I took over a family farm. And these farms, my farm was established in 1690. And that's pretty near the beginning of the colonization of South Africa. So, here I am inheriting this piece of land. And so I had to start dealing with the ethics and whatnot of that. What do you do? Ethically, the only right thing to do if you inherit stolen goods is you got to give them back. And that's where I found the limits of my own goodness. I thought, I want to give it to my kids. I don't want to give, it wasn't me who took the land. It happened 330 years ago, and so on. So what I'm saying is that, if you're going to face the facts, if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, you have to recognize what we mean by yourself. Yourself is not something to be idealized. What I ended up doing, by the way, was I mortgaged my farm to buy a farm next door so that the farm workers could also own land, and then we formed a partnership. But please note, my self-interest is preserved there, but I'm taking account that, so I want to have something, but I mustn't forget other people want it too. So we have to find some. So I'm using that kind of personal story to illustrate this point, the second point I'm wanting to make, which is that there are limits to our goodness. When I said that we mammals, the same seven, as it happens, 7 basic emotional values, they include nice things like play and attachment, bonding, and lust, if that's a nice thing. But it also includes things like rage and fear, and dominance behaviors and so on. These are also natural things. There's a great deal of self-interest built into these phenotypic endowments. The value system of all living things is, that I want to survive, and I want my offspring and my species and so on.
That's how we got here.
Yeah. So I think that how are we going to better flourish as a species, and as a species in relation to what we do to other species and what we do to our planet and so on? I think we have to start with a recognition that we have built into us some pretty nasty predilections too. And we need to understand what they're there for, how they work, take account of them, not airbrush them out, even in our own beloved selves. As I said, for me, it was like a very painful business, frankly, to recognize, the morally right thing to do is to give my farm back, but I'm not going to do it because I don't want to, which means I'm not as good as I would like to be, then face that fact and then convey it, as I did in my case, to the farm workers who were, by the way, descended from the people from whom this land was stolen and also descended from slaves. Just talk about it, to say, I can see this is the right thing to do. This is what I can bring myself to do in that direction. What do you think? So I think we need to be more honest about the limitations of our goodness and recognizing that other people are also not only good. There are lots of shits in the world. We have to find ways of dealing with these facts about ourselves. So I think educating ourselves about the multiplicity of values. We have multiple values, even at the most rudimentary level of our phenotype. We have multiple values, and they're not all of them altruistic. Some of them are. Care is an altruistic, or at least largely altruistic. Play involves, you have to develop empathy if you're going to be able to learn how to play. But some of them are not. Rage is entirely self-preservative, and it's there. It exists. You just look around you, you see it all over the place. So these values, so we have multiple values and they conflict with each other. And we need to find ways of facing those facts and resolving these conflicts between the funny old mixtures, that we are. So my worldview in respect of these sorts of questions is not a utopian one. It's not an overly sentimental and idealistic one. It's a value-driven one, recognizing that we have a multiplicity of values. Some of them are pretty darn selfish, and we need to face those facts. If you don't face facts, you'll never find solutions as to how to deal with them.
Yeah.
So
I'm with you. Yeah.
I hope that begins to answer your question. But it comes down again, I will say as my final word on it, love your neighbor as yourself, but don't idealize who yourself is.
Yeah, it's not a bad starting point, is it? And I think it's an echo in a way of our conversation about epistemology, because there's no such thing as perfect knowledge or understanding. We should give up on that idea and get much more realistic about what's possible to know, and think about credences instead of beliefs, and be provisional and probabilistic. But I think the same can be true in an ethical and moral stance. There is no such thing as moral perfection, and ultimately even sometimes being super demanding of ourselves in an unrealistic way can have dangerous side effects and can work out badly. So maybe it's a cop-out, but again, this sort of sentientism idea isn't specific about the level of demandingness. It doesn't say, should you sell all your worldly possessions and donate everything to charity until you're as poor as the average person? It is not specific on demandingness. There's lots of different people with different views on how demanding we should be of ourselves ethically. But again, it just tries to set a very simple baseline of saying, moral consideration for all sentient beings. And what does that moral consideration mean? It means we wouldn't needlessly cause them suffering or death. That's the baseline. We can obviously do much more than that. We can help with flourishing, and we can, do all sorts of other wonderful things in the world. But at least let's set that as a baseline that we wouldn't, we'll aspire not to break. But no, I like the way you put that. It's a combination of a sort of an idealistic view, but also a realistic understanding of ourselves and who we are and how we've evolved. So fascinating. Thank you. And again, combines morality and a sort of naturalistic understanding of the world in a way I think is deeply important. It's not enough to focus on compassion. It's not enough to focus on a naturalistic understanding. We need the two. That's the essence of this idea. So, well, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. Thank you. It's a real privilege to get your insights on all of these crazily broad topics. What's the best way of people following you, buying your books, learning more about your work?
So I've enjoyed our conversation very much too, Jamie. Thank you very much for inviting me and for spending this time with me. When it comes to books, there's one book of mine that I wrote that I published last year, which I think covers everything we've talked about.
Yeah.
So that's what I would recommend. It's called The Hidden Spring, with the subtitle A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. And that's available in all the usual places. Of course, one hopes that one's readers will buy it from their local bookshop. I discovered recently that my local bookshop in turn buys it through Amazon. So The Hidden Spring is the book of mine that I would very much encourage people to read if they want to know more about why I think what I think along these lines. It addresses all of these sorts of issues. And then other than that, I'm only on one social media platform, that's Twitter, which was recently bought by a school. Elon Musk went to the same school as me.
Really? Were you buddies there?
No, he was younger than me. But so the only social media I'm on is Twitter. My handle is at Mark_Solms. And so I always post things that, lectures that I've given and papers that I've published and thoughts on matters of the kind that interest people like you and me. I do it there. Thanks again very much, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. And let me know if I can help your son nudge you towards, your final steps in your journey to veganism, to put our sentiocentric compassion into action. But it's been a genuine pleasure. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you as a guest on Sentientist Conversations. And the danger is we just agree with each other too much. But
it's a wonderful thing you're doing. So good luck with it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Cheers.